Hello Dragonfly Swarm! After a long year of waiting, Kazuha is finally coming back to the limited banner with his highly anticipated rerun. And as of one of my favorite characters in the entire game, I couldn't not make a video discussing the important things to know about Kazuha as of 2.8. So naturally, in this video, I'm gonna go in depth with why Kazuha is such a highly sought after character, what makes him so strong, and all of the things you need to take into consideration before pulling for him. But disclaimer, this is all assuming you want objective guidance on whether or not you should pull for him. So with that said, if this video helps you, please consider subscribing to keep up with future content, and let's jump right into everything you need to know about the state of Kazuha in 2.8 Genshin Impact. I feel like we need to start by talking about Kazuha's humble beginnings, and all the controversy behind his strength during his original banner. Kazuha's first banner ended up selling almost as bad as Keqing's rate up banner, which for context is pretty bad. And there are a few reasons why this happened, the less important reason being that Inazuma was just around the corner, so lots of people had simply decided to skip in favor of Ayaka and other upcoming Inazuma characters. But there was actually another more controversial reason as to why people skipped him as well, that reason being that he was brutally compared to Sucrose. The argument was that Kazuha was literally just a 5-star version of Sucrose and therefore was an unnecessary pull for anyone that wanted him just for his strength, leaving him with, as I said, pretty bad total banner sales. But how true is that comparison? Is he really worth pulling for if you already have Sucrose, especially if she's at C6? Well, the first thing to take into consideration is that as much as they do have in common with each other, they are also very different characters for a few different reasons when put into practice. Sucrose is a character that before C6 only really provides elemental mastery and elemental resistance shred to her team, which overall only significantly boosts the damage of reaction-based teams. And don't get me wrong, on those teams she's earned her place as one of the best supports you could ask for. She also provides pretty decent crowd control, sometimes inconsistent, but overall not bad. At C6 though, Sucrose gains the ability to grant a flat 20% elemental damage bonus to her team based on whatever element she swirls, which is much like Kazuha's buff, and it actually makes her very competitive with Kazuha's supportive capabilities in reaction-based teams. So if you're comparing a C0 Kazuha to a C6 Sucrose on teams such as Melt, Vaporize, or Soup teams, she actually does compete quite aggressively with his potential, sometimes even outperforming his potential. However, there are differences in their abilities. At C0, Kazuha has the ability to grant a very large elemental damage bonus to his teammates when he swirls an element, just like C6 Sucrose, but unlike her, his bonus is not capped at 20%, and based on his elemental mastery, can actually far exceed a 20% elemental damage bonus. On top of this, his crowd control is very practical and very strong, and his personal damage potential is amazing, especially considering how little investment you need for it to become passable damage. So what does that mean when comparing him with Sucrose overall? Well, to put it simply, a C6 Sucrose with the right build and good gameplay will probably slightly outperform C0 Kazuha in reaction-based teams. However, Kazuha has the advantage of being good in any elemental team, even those that don't make use of elemental mastery bonuses, such as freeze teams and mono element teams. However, it's also worth mentioning that he actually ends up outperforming Sucrose in taser teams as well, despite it being a reaction-based team, because he has many more effective ways of consistently double swirling Electro and Hydro, which will grant the entire team his elemental damage bonus, and also, elemental mastery is quite inconsistent in taser teams, rendering a non-C6 Sucrose strictly worse than Kazuha in taser teams. So C0 Kazuha is essentially a much more practical and versatile anemo buffer support than Sucrose is in most situations, only finding competition against her at C6 and in reaction-based teams. But at the time of his original banner, many players hadn't figured this all out yet, probably partly because they weren't interested, given that Inazuma was right around the corner, and also partly because Kazuha is a very complex character. So let's discuss more about Kazuha himself. There are a lot of reasons why basically everyone considers Kazuha a top-tier character, the most blatant of which being that he can play as an anemo support. Anemo supports are notoriously versatile units with lots of applicable uses, and I'll link my anemo video below if you want to learn more about why anemo characters in general are so strong. But moving on with Kazuha, with his ability to easily proc Swirl and the use of 4-piece Viridescent Venerer, Kazuha is no exception to this rule, and he even proved to be generally better at his job than many other anemo supports, specifically because of the complex interactions he's able to have with the teams he's placed on and the immense control he can have over a team's rotations. He can easily cause double swirl mechanics in freeze and taser teams because of the high anemo gauge on his hold skill. He very easily spreads chain reactions with his infused elemental plunge thanks to his first ascension passive, and his burst allows him to grant all of these damage bonuses while he's off the field as well. And the cool part about this is that despite him having quite a few complex interactions for people who want an intensive rotation experience, he's also pretty easy to pick up and understand from the get-go as long as you have a basic understanding of the swirl reaction, not to mention how easy his abilities are to use in literally any combat scenario. And in regards to his own power, it's worth mentioning that Kazuha can be extremely low investment and still have access to his highest supportive capabilities. Because of the fact that his crowd control doesn't need investment and his sought after buffing potential is only tied to his elemental mastery and his ability to swirl, you could theoretically never level up a single one of his talents and still have full access to his his elemental damage bonuses, which is what the majority of Kazuha players use him for anyways. And if you do decide to invest in him, he quickly begins to deal surprisingly large damage with his skill plunge and his overtime burst damage, allowing him to become competitive with powerful anemo sub DPS units like Venti as well. And all of this ties into why I would consider Kazuha one of the most timeless characters you could pull for in Genshin Impact. Because of how practical he is, Kazuha feels playable against any enemies in the game, minus flying animal enemies I suppose, but that was probably obvious. I say this because although he thrives in AoE situations with lots of enemies because of his satisfying crowd control and AoE swirl potential, he works just as well against large single enemies and bosses as well. And in regards to team building, the only teams in the entire game that don't need Kazuha are physical teams, Xiao teams, and Mono Geo teams. Any other teams, while they don't require him, do generally see a significant damage increase with him. As an anemo unit, Kazuha already has a natural compatibility with any elemental teams in the game, but his extent of this compatibility is further enhanced by his in-combat versatility and his ability to flex a team's rotations in whatever way benefits them. And this is quite apparent given that 14 out of the 20 limited rate-up banners since his release have featured characters whose best teams include Kazuha as a suggested buffer support. It's very unlikely that he'll ever lose value as a support in elemental teams, not only because he's an anemo character, but because he's one of, if not the most practical anemo characters of them all. But for all of the hyping up I just did, as much as it was completely warranted, Kazuha does have a few weaknesses that you need to consider even if you've already decided you're pulling for him. The first thing to consider is that in order to be at his best, a better option than Sucrose for example, Kazuha needs a lot of elemental mastery. Most commonly, he's run with a triple elemental mastery artifact build and an elemental mastery weapon with lots of EM and energy recharge substats, and this makes it a bit difficult to enjoy his personal damage potential, especially in single target situations, because regarding his personal damage in single target situations, he would technically benefit more from an anemo goblet and a crit circlet, but that really shouldn't matter too much considering he makes up for his own lack of personal damage by significantly increasing his team's damage. And plus, with high elemental mastery, his swirl damage will be very good either way. And while I personally recommend buffer Kazuha over sub DPS Kazuha because Venti and Jean exist, you can still run sub DPS Kazuha, but you'll have to sacrifice quite a large chunk of his elemental damage buff in order to gain a significant amount of personal anemo damage. Another weakness to consider, dragging us back to my earlier comparison, you should keep in mind that Sucrose's potential does compete very closely with Kazuha in reaction-based teams, at least until your Kazuha reaches C2, in which he becomes blatantly better than Sucrose and every other anemo support in pretty much every scenario. Even without C2 though, he provides a lot of power to a lot of teams. And the final weakness, which isn't really a weakness in my opinion, is that Kazuha requires decent game knowledge in order to use correctly. Yes, he's generally an easy character to play and is very practical to use, but you do have to have a basic understanding of swirl's mechanics and things like double swirl, chain reactions, and Kazuha's own interactions with these mechanics when on the field. I mostly just say this because infusing the wrong elements or swirling to chain the wrong reactions can effectively completely lock Kazuha out of his support power, and I don't think that's very swag. In conclusion, my final takeaways for Kazuha in 2.8 are as follows. Kazuha is stronger than ever, obviously, because the more elemental characters that come out, the more teams he can fit on. And it's become quite obvious that he's one of the most objectively enjoyable characters in the game because I don't think I've ever seen a Spiral Abyss patch where he had lower than a 90% play rate from players who owned him. So I can confidently say that Kazuha is a character that almost any Genshin player can pull for and find enjoyment with. He's insanely versatile, very practical to use in almost any combat scenario, provides absurd damage buffs to his teams, and does it all while being very cheap to build. And he has so few weaknesses, most of which can be solved simply by having decent game knowledge. And trust me, I sat here trying to think of weaknesses because this video almost felt biased considering how highly I've been speaking of him, but unfortunately honestly it isn't biased. It's just that Kazuha is one of the most valuable characters in the game and has remained the most popular character in the Spiral Abyss for pretty much the entire year since his last banner. So there's lots of viable reasons to pull for him if you're comfortable with it, but again, if you're worried about FOMO, Sucrose is a viable alternative for buffer Kazuha, and Jean and Venti are great alternatives to sub DPS Kazuha. But that about sums up the calm before the storm, and by that I mean the Kazuha guide, because I cannot wait to cover his full kit. Until then though, you should totally subscribe and like this video if it helped you in any way, and also consider following me on Twitter or joining my Discord server, because I would love to see you around in my community. Alright, I'm gonna go Kazuha lovers. I will see you in a few days.